Today is already off to an interesting start. So we just got out of our military briefing, first military briefing of the day, and just a couple quick insights before I run to my next event. First and foremost, I learned today that there are at least 3 frameworks of international law of war, human rights law, which does not apply to war, but rather to kind of police action, international humanitarian law, and law of armed conflict. And these are 3 different frameworks, and depending on which law applies, you get incredibly different results as to whether or not an action is legal or illegal under international law of war. The law of armed conflict tends to apply between state actors, but we have a situation, obviously, where just down there over in Gaza, about 20 kilometers down that way, we don't have a state. We have a territory, and I think there's a couple factual questions around what's going on there. One issue is whether it's occupied or not. If it's occupied by Israel, then human rights law applies to Israeli actions in Gaza, and that would be incredibly limiting in terms of what Israel can do, which is, I think, part of why you hear people who oppose Israel's actions calling Israel an occupier, because that conclusion, and being whether or not Israel occupies Gaza, by the way, is a conclusion, not a fact. It takes some analysis, although based on what I've heard, there's really nothing compelling suggesting that Gaza has been occupied for about 20 years by Israel. But that said, if Gaza is occupied, then human rights law applies. If human rights law applies, then Israeli actions are limited to effectively police actions, and you have to do things like arrest terrorists instead of kill them on the spot, and we don't have concepts like proportionality. If, on the other hand, the area is not occupied by Israel, it is either stateless or a non-state actor, then we get into whether or not international humanitarian law applies or whether law of armed conflict applies. But in both cases, Israel is entitled, under international law, without committing war crimes, to take substantial actions to destroy the terrorists who are, like, for example, shooting rockets. And so if a terrorist shoots a rocket from a hospital, Israel has the right, under both of those frameworks of law, to respond by firing at that hospital, because proportionally, even if civilians die in that process, these frames of international law of war would permit that action so long as it's proportional. The problem that was identified today is that these rules of law are very difficult to apply and to work with when there is what is being referred to as asymmetric lawfare, Lawfare, as in warfare, but with law. And the definition, the working definition I jotted down is asymmetric lawfare is where one side is law-abiding and the other is not, and the side that is not abiding by the rules of law uses the media to make it look like the law-abiding side is actually violating it and are war criminals. And this is a well-known tactic that was interesting to learn about. When I thought of asymmetric warfare previous to an hour ago, I would have described it as a military conflict where one side is strong and one side is weak, or guerrilla warfare. But asymmetric lawfare, interestingly, is this idea that you're fighting a war effectively, but the 2 different sides don't follow the same rules. And in fact, one side is embedding themselves, this is well known, embedding themselves in population centers, right, building tunnels under hospitals deliberately, firing rockets from hospitals deliberately, which is obviously war crimes. If in fact Hamas were a state actor, there would be no question that what they're doing is a war crime. But since they are not, when Israel responds, this is how things get complicated. Anyway, just some brief thoughts. I have to rush off to the next meeting, but this concept of asymmetric lawfare, I think, helps shed some light, and the knowledge that there are actually 3 different frames, 3 different choices of law: human rights law, international humanitarian law, and the law of armed conflict, each of which would provide different results. Turns out to be a pretty interesting aspect about understanding the legality of this conflict.